One of the most hotly debated aspects of Dragon Ball Super is its canon or its continuity. Now, for those of you who might not know, I already did a video on the whole canon debate subject where I just say, I don't care about canon, I don't like profiling things under canon as though I'm some kind of big authority on it, especially in a series like Dragon Ball, which, with Dragon Ball Super, has taken a very odd approach to what counts and what doesn't count, and what is it exactly a sequel or rather midquel to. And Toriyama has never even talked about canon. Any interview that you find online that says Toriyama said this is 100% canon is completely false. Kanzenshu has verified the fact that Toriyama has never talked about canon or even continuity, and so it's just really a blanket statement that people like to throw around to put more weight behind their arguments. And if the only thing that I would actually consider the closest thing to like 100% canon, quote unquote, would be the original 42 volumes of the manga, and everything else can just fit into separate continuities that are in some way similar to the manga and in other ways very, very different. In fact, several guidebooks and supplementary material even refers to, say, the Dragon Ball films that can't take place in the main series as alternate universes. So, designating the Z anime as a separate continuity from the manga, or Kai as a separate continuity from both of them, or GT as separate from completely everything else, feels like something that is at least that much well established as part of the franchise. However, Dragon Ball Super is a very strange beast in the way it's written and the way it's presented to us. The whole crux of the Dragon Ball Super writing process is this. Akira Toriyama, the original series creator, he sits down and he writes outlines for what happens in the stories. And in these outlines, he gives fairly vague guidances or indications or bullet points of what happens in a specific episode or what happens in a specific arc. And I say these are very vague because the way quite a few scenes happen between the anime versus the manga are vastly different. And when you say compare the first big kind of alteration between them, the hit fight between the anime and the manga, it is very obvious that Toriyama just wrote Goku fights Hit, Goku somehow becomes 10 times more powerful than Vegeta, and yes, I do believe that was probably a specific comment because both the anime and the manga highlight the fact that Goku has become 10 times over Vegeta's power, and then Goku forfeits the fight because Hit can't truly go all out with him. And then you have more bigger examples in the Goku Black arc, where in the anime, Goku Black invades the past and he fights Goku to power up. This doesn't happen in the manga. In the anime, the reveal of Goku Black, who he is, what he is, and what is his backstory with Goku is completely different than it is in the manga. In fact, Goku doesn't even meet Zamasu in the manga whatsoever, which was kind of like a big point in the anime. And then there are more differences showing up as we see. Some are bigger, some are smaller, but overall, these things are supposed to be based on the same outline that Toriyama provides both Toyotaro and Toei at the animation studio. And this is where things get really, really dicey, because you have these simultaneous products that are both based on the same thing, and they're supposed to to count, quote unquote, to various different degrees. For example, let me explain this a bit better. With the anime, it is very clear that the anime is the main product. That is the main driving force. That's what everybody is watching. That's what everybody is always talking about. And the manga is very much treated as a sort of byproduct or as a promotional item to the anime. This has, of course, changed as time has gone on, and Toyotaro has been allowed a bigger page count. I believe his chapters are almost 50 pages now, so he actually does have a lot of time to tell an actual story, whereas beforehand his chapters were very, very short. He had a very small page count, and in retrospect, reading stuff like the Battle of Gods arc and the Universe 6 arc feels like reading a glorified recap that's almost the same as the anime with some differences that I already highlighted. But of course that has changed. But this is where things get even more interesting, where Toriyama is far more involved with the manga. We know this. Toriyama and Toyotaro himself have commented on this several times. And this makes a lot of sense, because Toriyama is not an animator. He's not an animation supervisor, he's not an animator, he is a mangaka. So it makes sense that if you're going to have Toriyama involved with this stuff, and you're drawing a monthly manga that doesn't need like constant supervision every week for a new chapter, it makes sense that Toriyama would, get Toyotaro's like prototype chapters, let's call them. He'd get the prototype and he'd say, I like this, I don't like that, or put a gag here, or change this. And it makes sense that Toriyama would help this guy out. And as we've seen in the Universe Survival arc, things have become even more interesting because several of the Gods of Destruction were specifically designed by Toyotaro. And some of them were designed jointly by Toriyama and Toyotaro together, while a handful of them were designed by Toriyama. So Toyotaro does have a big influence now, even in the anime, and I wouldn't be surprised if he actually contributed a lot of the fighter designs as well, because even though the recent episodes have revealed that the Universe Survival arc is going to be a lot smaller in scale than we initially thought, that is still like 65 new fighters who need to be introduced. So I suspect that a lot of them won't ever be seen, but those who are seen were probably designed by Toriyama or Toyotaro, or together as the Gods of Destruction were. So there is another interesting bit of overlap happening over there. So Toyotaro is beginning to like influence the anime with his own contributions. But this whole situation is very fascinating. I don't think I've ever seen a show that's done quite like this. It's kind of like if Logan's script was finished, and then Fox told somebody, like it told James Mangold, here, make the Logan movie, and then it told, the Legion showrunner, here, make Logan TV show, and both of them are based on the same script, and they come out roughly at the same time as one another. It's really weird, it's really interesting, and I feel like it's probably the cause of some issues that are present with Dragon Ball Super, because Toriyama is a guy who is very slapdash in his writing. He's very much a guy who kind of makes shit up as he goes along, and for a lot of the manga, his ability to make these haphazard ideas or potentially bad ideas work is probably one of his biggest strengths. And I wouldn't be surprised if one of the biggest problems with the anime and the manga for Super is because he is the guy who's building the foundation. And because his foundation isn't exactly the greatest thing ever most of the time, I can see why people would have problems figuring out how to like build off of them into a fitting climax, whereas Toriyama is, like I said, a dude who isn't like the greatest writer of all time, but he is very good at making his own bullshit kind of work and getting you kind of invested in it, even if all common sense should tell you not to be. But now talking specifically about the continuity of Dragon Ball Super, this is where shit gets weird and even more interesting, and I can understand why people are debating on it so much. So the manga is a very simple case. The manga, I feel like if you want to insert it into the chapters after Kid Buu is beaten but before Oob shows up, I feel like you could pretty safely do that. There's no Gregory in the manga. There's no reference to filler or anything. There's really no big or even small discrepancies that I can, name off the top of my head that can just make it impossible to fit the manga of Super into the original Dragon Ball manga. Like I said, Gregory, who is a filler-only character who was designed by Toriyama to expand on Goku's anime training on Kaio-sama's planet, he is in the anime, but he wasn't in the Battle Gods movie, and he's not in the Dragon Ball Super manga. So I feel like the manga is a very simple case here. But the Super anime is where shit gets kind of weird. So a lot of people, myself included, thought that Toei kind of views Dragon Ball Super as a sequel to Kai. And one of the biggest reasons for why Super was rushed out the door the way it was, besides the success of Resurrection F, was because Dragon Ball Kai was coming to an end. The Buu Saga version of Kai was over, and they wanted to keep a Dragon Ball show in that same time slot, because I think Dragon Ball has kept that time slot for decades and decades and decades, and that's kind of a tradition for Dragon Ball to air at that time slot in Japan. And And when they started reusing footage of Kai, some people assumed that, well, of course you're going to use the Kai footage because that looks better than the Z one. It was like updated, remastered, that kind of stuff. So it makes sense that they would use Kai footage. But then the Frieza arc happened, the Resurrection F arc happens, and Dragon Ball Super blatantly mentions Ginyu taking over Bulma's body and Bulma remembering that. And that happens in the Z anime, that happens in Kai, but it doesn't happen in the manga. So them reusing Kai footage and then mentioning something that happened in Kai or Z made us think, okay, this is definitely not like a proper sequel to the manga. This is like a sequel probably to Kai because that's the footage they're using. And for a while, things, seemed, fairly stable on that front. But then things got complicated again very recently with the Yamcha baseball episode. And the Yamcha baseball episode is something that wasn't in Kai at all. It was completely cut out of Kai, but it was part of the Z anime. So that's already kind of weird. That already threw people for a loop because by that point we all thought, okay, this is like an unofficial sequel to Kai. But now that's kind of hard to say because they have the Yamcha baseball episode, and Yamcha being part of a baseball team was not in Kai. And then the Gohan thing happened a couple weeks afterward. And the Gohan thing is even weirder. It's probably one of the weirdest continuity or canon, whatever you want to call it, issues that I've ever seen, where in episode 205 of Dragon Ball Z, they're already filming a Great Saiyaman movie. That's part of the filler of the Great Saiyaman arc. But the robbers who appear in the Dragon Ball Super Gohan episodes that concern the Great Saiyaman, those guys never show up in the anime. They only show up in the manga. So you have this thing where they're referencing Z filler. I don't know if it was in Kai, but I know it was in Z. They're referencing Z filler, but they're using manga-only characters in it who were never in Z and probably not even in Kai. So that's kind of weird. That's a pretty interesting bit of continuity fuck-ups over there. And then the issue gets even bigger once you start thinking about Dragon Ball Super filler, quote-unquote. Now, the whole point of filler in anime is to give the original creator time to push ahead with the storyline. It's there so the animation staff and the animation studio can keep the anime going for a set number of weeks or months while the manga pushes ahead, so by the time the filler is over, they can basically continue adapting the main storyline. Dragon Ball always had like an interesting way of doing filler, where besides the Garlic Jr. arc in Dragon Ball Z, there was never really a full-on filler arc. They usually just expanded scenes that were already in the manga, and they expanded them, like Goku and Vegeta fighting Buhan. That doesn't happen. Buhan just smashes them into the ground, and then they become Vegito. And speaking of Vegito, base Vegito never fights Buhan in the manga. He just immediately becomes a Super Saiyan, and then he beats the shit out of Buhan. But in Z and in Kai, he beats the shit out of Buhan in base, and then he transforms into a Super Saiyan. And then there are other examples of that, where like the Majin Vegeta fight, Goku versus Majin Vegeta, that fight happens in like the span of like 10 pages, but it's like half an hour at least long in the anime. So those are only like the biggest, most famous examples I can think off the top of my head. And then there's Goku versus Frieza, which is probably the most notorious one, where it's really, really long as hell, even in the Kai version. So Dragon Ball always had like an interesting thing with filler, but Super has a more traditional method where between the big storylines there's always like filler, quote unquote, between the big story arcs. So after Goku and Beerus fight, there's a few episodes that kind of set up Frieza's return, but then they're completely divorced from it. They're just, here's what everybody is doing between the big story arcs. And then we had like the Patafu mini arc, between the Universe 6 tournament and the Goku Black arc. And a lot of people assumed, oh, well, this is just kind of like Super's filler, quote-unquote, and it doesn't count because Toriyama probably didn't write it. But things get even more interesting or complicated or both, depending on your viewpoint, when you realize that in the Goku Black arc, they directly reference the Potafu arc. It's in episode 57 when Black uses Rosé for the first time, and in that episode, Goku comments on the fact that Vegeta is now beating the crap out of an evil copy of Goku when Goku was, was fighting an evil copy of Vegeta not too long ago. And that's the only big example I can name off the top of my head. I'm sure there are others. But yeah, the whole continuity of Dragon Ball Super is really weird. The way the show is built up and then adapted into the anime and manga is really weird, and how it fits into past events is also, like I said, really, really weird. Which, but this isn't even really a rant video, because I'm not particularly angry about this. I just find this an interesting point of contention between people. And I feel like I actually really like this structure because, like I said, a lot of people in the fandom like to obsess about canon and what is canon and what isn't. And then when you just have this blatant situation where neither the manga or the anime really can completely count or be canon, quote unquote, it just creates this really interesting situation where people just have to shut up and admit, yeah, Dragon Ball doesn't really give a Kardashian's ass about canon or continuity, so maybe we shouldn't either. And I would most certainly enjoy this because fuck canon debates in Dragon Ball. So yeah, guys, I hope I highlighted the interesting continuity / canon of Dragon Ball Super. What are your guys' thoughts on it? Do you like this approach? Do you dislike it? I like it because it, kind of highlights how stupid it is to debate the Dragon Ball canon, but I'm not gonna pretend like it probably isn't the cause of a lot of writing issues because like I said, Toriyama isn't exactly the greatest guy when it comes to building a solid foundation for a storyline. Like, the entire Cell arc, the entire setup for that entire arc is some of the most convoluted shit I've ever seen, and it mostly doesn't even work, besides a few other points. And that's just the only big example of Toriyama's kind of slapdash storytelling that I can come up with off the top of my head. So yeah, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.